to today's webinar, Data Wrangling for Youth Program Evaluation. My name is Rebecca Hauer. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Manager here at YouthREX, and I'm your host today. So today's webinar is extremely practical. You're going to be able to use what we share today pretty immediately. We're going to talk about how you can use a spreadsheet like Excel or Google Sheets to organize, manage, and visualize your program evaluation data. The guide to this discussion will be our expert data wrangler, Sidney Shapiro, who works with us in our Northeast Hub, and he will offer some solutions to some real-life data management questions and challenges that youth programs experience on an ongoing basis. So a couple of things to keep in mind as we go forward. We are going to record this webinar and it will be uploaded later, both to the YouthREX site and also to the course that we're running as well. If you have any problems with audio quality today, please try calling in with a phone. The audio problems are usually internet connection issues. If you want to ask a question or share a comment, we would love that. You'll see on the side of the right-hand side of your screen in the little GoToWebinar box that there's a question area, and you can type directly in there. If you have questions for us about webinar quality, you can ask them there. If you have questions for Sidney on webinar content, you can ask them there. We're holding, we'll respond to your questions at the end of the webinar. We've held some time directly for that. And also, if anything tweaks your imagination or really is something that you think needs to be shared broadly, you can tweet us at Rex for Youth as well. So a bit about YouthREX for those of you maybe who haven't heard of us before. YouthREX stands for Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange. We were launched in November 2014, so 2 years ago, as part of Ontario's Youth Action Plan. We're funded by the Ministry of Children and Youth Services, and our mandate is to support grassroots youth and youth-serving organizations to increase youth well-being outcomes by integrating knowledge and evaluation into the development and delivery of youth programs. We work across the province with 5 partner universities. You can see them. We have, we call them regional hubs. We have a regional hub model. So you can look at this map and see where your hub university would be. And then you can go to our website at youthrex.com and where we work, and then you can connect with the managers in each of those offices for any questions or further resources. We have, how we work is that we have 3 program streams. They're interrelated, they work together. Webinars are part of our knowledge mobilization stream, but that also includes an online hub, the Exchange for YouthREX. It's at exchange.youthrex.com, where we curate a library for youth work, which includes, right now, over 800 resources that can support your youth work in a variety of formats. We also host an evaluation toolkit and a measures inventory there. And capacity building is our online courses, and I welcome the course participants today who are in our online program evaluation course for youth well-being. They're joining us. This webinar aligns with one of the modules in that course, so welcome. We also offer a face-to-face critical youth work course as well as workshops across our hubs. If you're interested in a workshop, contact us or your regional hub manager, and we will organize one for you in your region. And finally, customized evaluation supports. Customized evaluation supports are our face-to-face service that we work specifically with eligible grassroots youth organizations and act as your coach on all things related to evaluation. You can go onto our website at youthrex.com and learn more about that. You can also then apply. It's a really short application, and we'll be in touch with you within 24 to 48 hours to follow up and have a conversation with you about what that would look like for you if you're eligible. Okay. And moving forward, Great. So today I'm happy to introduce our guest presenters. One, Corliss Bean is a research and evaluation specialist here at YouthREX, and she is the lead on our online certificate course, which I mentioned, Program Evaluation for Youth Wellbeing. And this webinar is doubling as a part of the course as well as a more public offering. So Corliss is going to come on and just do an update with course participants. And then finally, Sidney Shapiro, he will lead the bulk of our webinar today. He's a doctoral student in human studies at Laurentian University, where his research focuses on political and social interactions in a campus environment. He is a fantastic research assistant at the YouthREX's Northeastern Hub, and he has extensive experience in data collection and analysis in a wide range of settings, everything from large-scale data analysis, program evaluation, research tool design, and implementation. So you'll hear from him shortly, but before that, let's pass it over to Corliss for a course recap.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca. So yeah, I just wanted to give a quick welcome to all of our course participants who are on the webinar today. Just in terms of a little bit of an update, we had our fourth assignment, which was developing a visual representation of our logic model due at the end of November, and we still have some participants submitting those assignments. So if you haven't done so yet, please submit that when you can. Remember, these are suggested deadlines. We have assignment number 5, which is where we develop our evaluation questions and our methods for this, due December 5th, so that's coming up shortly. And then we have our final assignment, assignment number 6, which is where we set up our data analysis plan and our interpretation plan. And this is our final assignment due the last week of the course, which is December the 16th. So right now we're progressing through our 8 out of 10 lessons. Right now we're on analyzing and interpreting quantitative data, which aligns very well with what Sidney will talk about today. And this is the last day of this week in terms of our suggested timelines, and then we'll be progressing on to analyzing and interpreting qualitative data. And if you didn't receive our email yesterday, in terms of if you're not registered with YouthREX's mailing list, we just wanted to let you guys know that we will be offering a second cohort of the Understanding Program Evaluation for Youth Wellbeing online certificate that I'm just discussing right now. So registration for that is open now, and the deadline for registration is the 14th of December, and the course will start on the 6th of January. So yeah, we encourage you to apply. For those participants who are currently engaging in the course, but you're not able to finish the course, we encourage you to also apply so that you can hopefully finish the course, but we also welcome some brand new participants as well. So I'll turn it over to Sidney right now. We have we're really excited to have Sidney here, as Rebecca gave a great welcome to him. What we would just like to do is open Sidney's slide deck. So we will be uploading a new slide deck. He just made some last minute changes, and we want to make sure that your slide deck that you're downloading in the handouts is also the same that we're going to walk through today. So if you did download the PDF in the handouts already, we encourage you to delete that one. Sorry about that. And we will upload a new one, and then Sidney will walk us through in just a quick moment. So
Hey,
I think
everybody.
we're good to go. So
I hope
yeah.
you can hear me. All right. Okay, I wear a cowboy hat for the occasion, naturally. So today we're going to talk about what to do with your data. Why is this critical? Because quite often people have tons of different pieces of paper floating around their office. They have all these different pieces that they collect as part of their activities, and we basically want to be able to see how we can take that data and do something useful with it. We're going to look at a bunch of different ways to manipulate today, and we're going to focus on basically how to get some sense around what you should do with it. We're going to talk today about inputting the data, preparing the data, and managing the data in hopefully a cohesive way. So let's go to the next slide. Awesome. All right, so we have some beginning questions, and these are really important because we want to be able to figure out how what we're doing fits onto a spreadsheet. Why a spreadsheet? Because a spreadsheet is usually the easiest way to track our activities in a really simple, easy to use, flexible, and sustainable system, right? So we basically want to take the data that we have, figure out what are we analyzing, and then put it into some box, put it into some form that we're able to keep on looking at it and figure out what we're doing. So we want to know, how do our activities fit into a spreadsheet? Like, how would we organize it? Most importantly, what questions do we want to know? So for example, if we wanted to know the minimum age, we want to know the average age, those would be simple things to figure out. If we want to ask much more complicated questions, we'd have to have a new strategy to figure out how we make that happen. Does what we want to know make sense? Is it possible to take two different measurements or two different numbers or two different words that we have in our spreadsheet and compare them? Or is it just not possible to make that comparison? So one of the questions that I'm tracking for my participants is how often do they show up? And another column is how often do they drink orange juice? Those things might not work together in terms of telling me useful information, although mathematically I could make that happen. It's really critical that the data that we're gathering and analyzing on an ongoing basis is linked to the logic model. So when you're building your logic model, which is the required first step, you're basically looking at what are my resources, what are my goals, both short-term and long-term. And you want to make sure that the data that you're gathering and the questions that you're asking to analyze it are linked to whatever your outcomes are supposed to be, to show those numbers for in your logic model. So if your long-term outcomes, for example, are satisfaction, what are the interim numbers that you're gathering, like, for example, satisfaction, feedback, surveys, or using a validated tool in order to build towards that point? And is the data that you're gathering allow you to answer those questions? So, like sometimes the data that we're gathering doesn't match up exactly with what our goals are, and that has to be refined. Let's take a look at the next slide. So when we embark on this amazing journey to enter all our data and have it organized, there's a lot of challenges, many more than are on this sheet, and we'll talk about some of them. So for example, this often happens to us, that you have people who, we set up a sheet, they're good to go, they enter the data, but they have so much data, or the data isn't part of their regular workflow, that entering data on a regular basis becomes a huge challenge. And if you leave it sitting for a few months, you eventually get to the point where you're simply not able to keep up, and that's a huge issue. We want to make sure that we're building accurate, useful, and meaningful statistics, and what that means is that the numbers that are coming out actually represent the program in a way that you can very quickly see a snapshot of what's going on and be able to talk about what's happening inside the program, that the intervention that you're doing is actually effective. We can gather data, or we can look at data in two totally separate ways. One of them is longitudinal, where you're saying, okay, so how many interactions do we have with our participants in the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter? How do we divide it by month? Which day of the week is the busiest? And we're looking at data over time. And the alternative to that is saying a cross-sectional analysis. Let's take all the data that we have in our database right now, and let's simply divide it, and we'll simply look at the statistics the way they are overall, right? So for example, how many total participants did we have? How many total, we could do that by year, for example. And we're talking about two different things. One is looking at the big picture, the snapshot of all the data that we have, versus looking at it over time and seeing how things change. Sometimes programs are interested in one, the other, or both. And you just have to be aware that there is a difference in setting it up in order to effectively build that type of strategy. And one of the most important things, and one of the difficulties, is that you need to gear your data collection towards answering your questions. So naturally, you have questions about your program. We're going to talk about many different kinds. By gathering the right kinds of data and by analyzing it in the right way, you're able to quickly and effectively answer that question. And the idea is that as you go forward and as you continue to collect data, those answers will update and change, and you'll be able to see real-time results in terms of what's happening right now. Let's go to the next slide. So there's data. Obviously not what we're talking about, but still. Now, these are some critical tips that you should be aware of that are very, very important. So for example, it's important to keep copies of your data. So if for some reason something happens to your computer and you lose the you lose the sheet or you lose your computerized stuff, you still have those pieces of paper saved. It's also important to back up whatever resource you're doing, whether you're using Dropbox or something else, so you have an online copy or an offsite copy or something, depending on what your needs are, in order that if there's a critical mistake or something happens, you're always able to go back to a previous version. And that's why when I work on sheets and when I recommend that when our clients work on sheets, they use versioning. So you save a file as version 1, and a couple weeks later you save it as version 2, and so on. So worst case scenario, you can always go back and check on that last version before something went wrong. Because oftentimes when you just press Control-Z and you try to go back iteratively a few steps, you can only go back 5 times. And it could be a systematic error which came up a long time before. So it's important to keep versions so you're able to just move forward. I just copy them or save as and then name it the next number. It's important to use consistent data labels. So if you are referring to one thing, it's important to use the same terminology to refer to it as you go forward and not change what that label is. Certain file formats, especially when you're sharing files between people, could be incompatible. So for example, in Excel, you have .xls, which is for older versions of Excel, like 2003 to 2007, and .xlsx, which is the newest versions, from 2007 onwards. So if you're sharing those back and forth, you may need to download a compatibility tool, or you have to save an older version to make it compatible across all the computers. So if you're working in an environment where you're sharing files, it's important to be aware of that. What I like to do is sit down and plan a strategy for what data we're collecting and how we're going to organize that in the cells and the formulas that we're going to put in. That way, I like to give myself a lot of room, so I can say, look, I know right now we're having, on average, 50 people join the program a year. So if I set up my sheet to accommodate 500, then I know that I'll have a number of years of flexibility in order to keep on adding data without having to change anything, without having to go in and change any formulas. We'll look at some examples of that today. And of course, save your files often on a regular basis. You could set your computer to automatically save the file as you work, and the more you work on the file, the more likely it is to have a problem. So let's go to the next slide. So if you haven't figured out yet what I'm talking about, this is what a table looks like. Okay, so we have the ID number at the beginning, which you could use if you want to pull out anonymous data. So you want to take out the name column and share it with somebody. You're able to just use the ID as the identifier that will link that information to other parts of your table or to other sheets or to other databases and so on. In this example, we have age, gender, sign-up date. They list the satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 5, and we put in allergies. You'll notice that the allergy, the Y, is red. And that is, we built in a validation tool that if somebody would answer yes for that particular question, it would highlight and tell us that there's a problem, right? And you could set that up to happen automatically so we could be aware that if there's a problem with our intervention or something we have to be aware of with our population, for example, some of our clients say every single person in our program has to have emergency contact information listed. And if it's missing, tell us. Tell us the percentage, and then we have built in a formula that will automatically look for are they all filled in? So the number of population equals the number of emergency contacts. And if they're different, let us know. If we're giving out peanuts as snacks and there's kids that are allergic to peanuts, we want to know that before the program begins. We want that information to be apparent. And this is just one example of how we can organize the data in terms of the table. Let's go to the next sheet. Okay, and this is just another way to look at that same data. So this is what Excel looks like, right? Which is a good way to effectively put your data. And that same table can just be put in rows and columns. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so there's a couple things that it's good to be aware of, right? The first one is, let's go back one more, forward. Okay, so the first one is that when you enter data, instead of entering it into the sheet just like this, which people find confusing, right? You know, typing across into the multiple boxes, and you may have many, many boxes going across or up and down. Often we put the categories going across and the participants going up and down. For example, if you're doing a demographic sheet. So the first one will be name and then a list of names, age and a list of ages, and so on. Let's go to the next sheet. So here on the left is an example of using a feature in Excel called form. So instead of entering the numbers manually side to side, you just set up the category. So for example, in this case, name, age, and if they like pizza. And then you press the form button, and you get that little pop-up, which allows you to enter the information in a different thing. You just press new, and it adds a new line. You type in those 3 cells, and sometimes it's easier to take it from the piece of paper version and actually copy that into the computer in order to computerize it. Or using an online form, this could be an easier way to put it in. The other thing which is good to know is that when you are dealing with a lot of data, so either up and down many participants or side to side many categories, oftentimes you could lose track of like what participant you're dealing with or what category you're in because you went down too far. So under View, you're able to click on Freeze Panes, and you could freeze the top row, freeze the first column. So if I clicked on Freeze the first column and I moved to the side, the names would always show up no matter what category I'm in. The same thing as if I froze the top row, I'd be able to scroll down and always see what category I'm in, or do both and get both of them happening. So no matter where you are on the sheet, you could see which category you're talking about and which person you're referring to. So it's just an alternative way to enter data and keep on the same page. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's really important to ask the right questions, right? Like to find out what data is useful to put in there that you could actually figure out your answers for. And these are just some examples of the things you can collect. We could look at demographics like age, gender, language, postal code. We could look at allergies and emergency contact information. We could look at intervention data, so your activity, how effective is it, did people like it, and so on. You know, based on their feedback, based on how many times they came. We could look at eligibility criteria. So for example, it's very common in the youth sector that if we know the age of people, we can calculate how many people are going to age out of the program versus how many people are eligible for it right now. And we could actually graph that into a bell curve to understand and allocate program resources. So if the majority of our participants are leading towards age 14, that's very different than programs which have a cutoff age of age 19 or so on, right? So understanding how that spread works could give us a lot of insight into how we should orient the program in terms of serving our population. We could gather satisfaction and feedback. We could use a Likert scale to ask people, and what we often do is we say on a scale of 1 to 5, did you have a good time? Did you learn anything? Are you going to come back? Are you going to tell your friends? And then we take those numbers. So you said 5, 5, 5. We put them into the computer. We ask a bunch more people. They could be anonymous or they could be with names. It depends on what the questions are and what you're going to use them for. And then we could figure out a lot of stuff from those participation things. Each one of those responses could become a data point that we could then compare to each other and see, is the program improving over time? Are people interested? Are there things that we can change which will influence how people enjoy themselves or what the outcomes are? And just in general, gathering feedback, either quantitative with numbers or qualitative with words, asking them to describe or to just quantify how much they like what's going on and if it's beneficial. And most importantly, it's probably a good idea to start from the top down. So look at what kind of data do your funders require. So funders have different requirements. So for example, if you're doing a form for United Way, they're looking at a particular number of interactions, and that's what they want, and that's what we should use our sheet to calculate, versus OTF, which has a completely different set of criteria in terms of the numbers that they're looking for. And we could start that from the beginning to make it much easier to fill out your end-of-year reports by working towards those goals. Next slide. So essentially, what are we talking about? When you take the piece of paper, like you see here on the bottom left, we're taking the fields and off of that sheet, and we're essentially setting up the sheet in the same way. Do we necessarily need every single field to be in our Excel document? Probably not. Right? There's probably stuff in there which we can't calculate, or we don't necessarily need to know all the time. It's important to have it on the paper, but it's maybe not necessary to do anything with it. It depends what you're using the sheet for. If you're using it to keep a database of contact information, that's great. But I'm sure you can understand that, for example, we can't really do much calculation with phone numbers, right? We could say if they're there or not, but we can't really do much besides that. So certain things, like for example, postal codes, we could do things with. We could map, we could stick on a map and find out what postal codes are our clients coming from and what the distance is between the program and them, and what we can learn from that. And there's a lot of other things we can do also. So for example, for one of our clients, we compared date of birth to reported age, and we looked at if there's a difference, or we compared grade to age, and we saw what are the distributions there. Next slide. So essentially, our challenge is we want to make sure that the data that we're collecting is able to fit onto the sheet, right? It's that's seamless in terms of that progression. On that note, like I said earlier, it's really important to plan for the future, right? What I do is, if you notice here on the right, I have an example sheet where I have my sign-up sheet, which is the piece of paper that I'm copying into the computer. I have the activities that I'm doing, the intervention. I make another tab for graphs and reports that I would be able to have, numbers that I could show to user funders, and I could have graphs that I could just stick into a report by copying and pasting. I have my variables, predefined drop-down lists, and other things that I'm just collecting there. And other could be other calculations or pivot tables or other things that I want to keep there on the side. I do that because instead of having everything on one sheet, and it gets very confusing, this allows you to expand each sheet to go down really far and be able to take large ranges of analysis and view them simply elsewhere. So if you look at the spreadsheet on the left, you'll notice that I have this green line in there. So what I do is, when I do every sheet, I ask that simple question: how many people do you think are you going to have over time? So, one group says we have 10 people a year. I'll make them a sheet that goes up to 100 spaces. So the sheet will theoretically work for the next 10 years, unless things change. And at line 101, I'll put that green line. So I know that whenever I make my formulas, they always run to the line. And then that way it's just a quick visual way for me to know how many cells are being calculated. In year one, as I type each of those 10 people's names in, the formula will automatically look from cell 1 to 100, say how many are in there. It will tell me, oh, we have 9 right now. It'll base the calculations on those. As I keep on adding people, and now I have 22 people, it'll base the calculation on 22. And that will happen automatically until the green line. When they reach the green line in 3 to 10 years, then it's time to call us again and figure out what's going on. So by doing that, it means that you have to do much less work to fix the formulas because they're already set up to analyze large ranges. Somebody asked me, well, why don't we just set up everything to 5,000? And the reason is simple, because if you make all your calculations huge, it's going to really slow down your computer and also make it difficult to manage that amount of space. So a reasonable extrapolation of what you're doing now would probably work, whether it's 100 or 500 or 1,000, whatever seems to work in your situation. In this case, the formula we're running, so the formula that's in the blue box, basically looks at cells C2 to C5 and figures out the average based on those scores. Now, if I told it equals average bracket C2 to C500, it would just look through the first 500 and come back, calculate all those numbers together, divide them by the number of entries, and give me a result, whatever that is. So even if I only had in this case, 4 entries, it would still give me the same number, but it would, as I add on, it would just keep on changing. And the cool thing is that if you base a graph off of that formula, then that graph will update as well as you go forward automatically. Next slide. Okay, and like I just said, it's really important to use validated lists. And we'll see a good example of this later, but the idea is that instead of having responses that people type in which may not match up, right? So if we were to count the number of times people said yes, no, weekends, or maybe, right, when they need bus tickets, that's easy to do because we could tell Excel, go in there and find how many yeses, how many nos, how many weekends. We could build a table based on that. But if you just type in random responses from people and people say yeah and people say yes, those are actually 2 different responses that Excel doesn't know are the same, even though we know, right? So by predefining your list, it just creates a drop-down that you're able to go in. And actually to do that, like you see on the left, is very simple. We just set up that range, and using data validation, we just define it in a little box up there by a tag. In this case, it's just called bus. And then in our sheet, we tell it, when using this field, look for the field called bus, and then it will just give us this drop-down every time. So it creates consistent ways to gather data, and it eliminates a lot of errors that can come up, and it gives us the best quality data possible. Next sheet, please. Okay, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. Oftentimes, what we have to do is create 2 columns in order to normalize data. So people have, data that they ask people, like, do you need a bus ticket? And they say, yeah, maybe, nah, no, never, yes. But those things actually mean only one of 3 actual answers, yes, maybe, or no. And once we do that, once we define what they actually are, then we're able to go through and set up a filter to figure out how many of those responses we actually have. And to do the analysis, like I say here, it's much easier with normalized data because you can count from known objects as opposed to figuring out what you have, which could be a lot more random. Next, please. So, in terms of data validation, to make sure that our data is good, we want to ask questions like, how many participants' activities do we have? What's our big number? And let's look at the example here. It says, how many participants are there? And in this case, there's 130, right? So we want to figure out, first of all, what are we counting? What are we going to compare out of? Like, what's our biggest group? So let's say, for example, our first question is participants. So in this case, we go through the list, we count how many participants there are, and it's 130. The next person who signs up, we're going to have 131, and these will automatically update as we go forward. The next question we have is how many participants have contact information listed? So we go through, we count how many people have contact information. We see 130, and right there I put a filter that says 100%. The next one says, how many participants provided allergy information? Only 116 did, and it turns the box red. So it tells us there's a problem. We need to go and call back those extra people because only 89% of people actually gave us an appropriate response. We have to go in and right? So this is a good way to validate the data, and those numbers will update every time we add one in or if we take one out, and so on. We could, it's just important to know what we're counting and what we're counting out of, and then it will give us a relative percentage. We want to know what can we count to give us our population size. So, like, what do we count to find the biggest thing? So this is often a problem. Everybody who signs up in our program has a name. Not everybody gives us a birthday. Not everybody gives us a phone number. Not everybody gives us contact information. Some people might not give you a name. So you have to figure out, based on the interaction, based on the data that you collect, which field is the best indicator of how many people you have, and count that, because that's going to be the biggest number. And then from there, we can look at all the other ones and compare their relative sizes. So in some programs, everybody does have a name. In some programs, everybody has an interaction. You're like, yes, I came and got the interaction. Other ones, it's different. So once we know what the biggest one is, we can compare with these other things. Next, please. Okay, so this is one of the most important slides. If there's one slide that you're going to take and get a tattoo of, it's this one. Why? Because if you look at the overall numbers, oftentimes the overall numbers are great. 80% satisfaction, everybody's happy. The problem is that it could be that one group is 100% happy and one group is 0% happy, but because they're different sizes, when you look at the overall picture, you get a different answer, right? So what we want to know is, if we take our big group, which is the group on top, and we divide it into different sized groups, and we look at demographics, age, gender, the intervention, or something else, how do they divide up? So again, we do the intervention, people seem generally happy, it seems to be working. What happens if we take their response, their satisfaction, and we divide them into groups, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and we graph those? Are people going to be happier at a particular age, or is everybody universally happy? Maybe it's a gender thing. Maybe girls are in that program are extremely happy, and males in that program are extremely unhappy, but because there's one group is larger than the other, it's hard to see. Now, intuitively, you may understand a lot of things that are happening in your program, like, for example, people are generally happy, or that it's generally 80% female. Like, you just know, because you deal with people every day. But it may be much more difficult to break down these sub-variables into different demographics, like, so, for example, language or gender or intervention. And what we want to know is, if you divide them into smaller groups, can we see that the intervention is working equally across all the groups, or is there another factor that maybe is influencing it? So, for example, if I know that everybody in our program is happy, all ages, all genders, all demographics, everything's great, except for 14-year-old males, they're the ones that are being left out, then there may be something I can do in order to fix that. Right? So there may be some other kind of intervention. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's some examples of that. I know it looks messy and confusing, but this is the idea. So what are these about? These are about status, right? So for example, if we want to know in our program, let's look at the upper right-hand graph, the little pie chart. So people come in, people leave. We want to know who's active, who's not active, who showed up last week. We could simply say, in this case, 73% of people are inactive or blank, which equals 120, it represents 127 people, versus the blue one, which 46 people are active, or 27%. And those numbers will change as we define people being active or inactive. If we look on the table at the top left, we're basically comparing the grade, like what grade are they in, for male, female, and other by gender on the left. And at the top, we're looking at the minimum, average, and max. So it's interesting to see that the average grade that males are in is grade 8. The average grade that females are in is grade 9. And if you said other, it's also grade 9. So maybe there's a reason why guys seem to be joining the program earlier than girls, and they're also leaving the program earlier than girls. Because guys go between grade 6 and grade 10, but girls, according to this chart, go between grade 7 and grade 11. So maybe there's a reason and how we could address that. We look at, if you look at the center chart at the bottom, we break down our participants by gender and by language. So there's a difference in terms of the numbers between male, female, and other for English speakers versus male, female, and other for Ojibwe and English speakers. So that would be something that maybe we should know. I mean, that by dividing them into subgroups, we're able to do a better analysis and an intervention. And on the left, we just are dividing by overall language. And on the right, we're looking for English, French, etc. by gender. And it's just a different way to present the same kind of data. Next, please. Okay, so first step, most important step, sit down with a piece of paper and figure out what do you want to track. What's reasonable that you can put into a spreadsheet in a way that you can actually go in there on a regular basis, update it, and make it part of your work cycle. Spreadsheets are great at counting things like numbers, but they're really not good at putting in words. So it's important to balance those two things. Next, please. Because if you are trying to use it to gather large amounts of qualitative data, it's going to be difficult to manipulate that in Excel. So it's much simpler to just count numbers. Let's have the next slide. And that's one of the first things you have to ask. Is it qualitative or quantitative? Are we counting or are we describing? How do fields relate to each other? Can they be calculated together? So if one of the things you ask your participants, did you eat Tim Hortons today? And what time did you wake up? And how are you doing in school? Those things may not have any correlation to each other. So just by asking them, we could mathematically calculate those together and get numbers, but they don't really mean anything. We should say, and that's the most important part, like what do they mean? How do we analyze them? How do we actually fit them together to make them make sense? Next, please. An easy way to do this that makes sense is using a validated tool. Our population sizes may be too small to actually find out if these tools that we're using are accurate, but if we use a validated tool or a tool that people have already checked out, that means that they're reliable. The results are the same over and over again. They're valid because we know what they're supposed to measure, and they're normed because they test them with thousands of people to make sure that these tools represent what they want to represent. Next slide. And you're probably saying to yourself, where do I find such validated tools? Simple. On the measures inventory, there's the website right there. And we have a whole range of tools from YouthREX that you're able to go and use validated tools in order to very simply figure out what tools, if you want to measure a certain thing, what tools are out there for you to be able to use. And that saves a lot of time for the developer. Next, please. All right, so now we're going to look at a bunch of different types of forms to give you some idea of, like, these are really simple of what you can analyze. And this is just the beginning, because you can add in thousands of fields, especially ones that are relevant to you. So here we have ID, name, we have John, Ringo, Paul, and George. We have their ages and genders. And in this form, we ask them for their consent, to make sure that we have the forms on file, for example. And then each program date, we're tracking their attendance. So if the people show up, we put an X next to it. So we have 3 people on May 1st, 4 people on June 1st, and 3 people on July 1st. And we just put an X, and we just count the number of X's next to each person. Next, please. And then we could use the same kind of thing for satisfaction. In this group, we have John, Yoko, Paul, and George. And we're basically looking, how happy were they? So I said at the end of every intervention, I said, on a scale of 1 to 5, how'd you like your program today? And John said, loved it, gave it a 5. Session 2, also a 5. Session 3, also a 5. He's super happy. Yoko didn't like the program very much. She gave a 2 the first time, a 1 the next time, and a 3 the third time. So if we look at the overall numbers, we could just add them together and divide them by the number of people, which gives us 16 overall out of 20 for the first session, 14 for the second, and 18 for the third, which gives us the percentages of 80%, 70%, and 90%. Next, please. Or we could use some simple features to look at differences between participants, the same numbers we just looked at. So we have the same overall session numbers, but if we put a dot next to each person indicating if they were happy, let's say, 5 or 4 and above, we see that most people, we have a lot of greens there, right? But Yoko's overall total, she was only 40% satisfied, whereas George and John were actually 100% satisfied. So we want to make sure that we understand what's happening with the individual participants as long as what's happening with the overall session. And those two numbers may give us a better idea of what's going on. So it could be that session 2, maybe Paul and Yoko weren't happy for a particular reason. Maybe we need to address why Yoko's unsatisfied overall. And we could do that by looking at the numbers. I mean, keep in mind that Paul had an 80% satisfaction and Yoko had a 40%. And you can understand how we could expand this to be much bigger to gather a lot more data to look at trends over time. Next, please. And here we see this sorted the other way. So we basically see that we have Bob, Pat, Mary, and Mark, and we have their individual scores as well as the overall ones. Next, please. Okay, and like we said before, we're gathering 2 different types of data. One counts, one describes. So we could say on a scale of 1 to 5, how much did you like the session? Everybody gives us a 5, a 3, a 4, a 2. Whereas if we describe it, we say, how do you feel about today's session? And people are going to say a lot of different words. Those words may be harder to quantify, right? Maybe harder to count together to get a number or statistic. Next, please. So there is a solution to that, right? Sometimes, instead of using numbers, we could say, on a scale of great, awesome, and yuck, how did you like today, right? And or something else, right? So on day 1, we just count. Well, we had 2 greats and 1 awesome. On day 2, we had 1 great, 1 awesome, and 1 yuck, and so on, right? And then we just add those together and then use those numbers as the statistic. So it doesn't really matter if we're counting explicit numbers or implicit numbers of groups that we could add together. But in the end, as long as they're consistent, we're able to understand how those things fit together. Next slide, please. And now the most important part. We're interested in hearing your questions. We could talk about some of the things based on what we talked about today. So if you have any questions, type it right in.
Thank you so much, Sidney. That was a whirlwind tour through the basic ways to use Excel. I'd like to invite everyone here, to send in your questions if you have any. But our first question, something that has come in, someone noticed the symbols in one of your Excel example sheets and had never seen that before and is wondering how to do that and what those mean.
Which symbols?
I think it was on slide 30. I don't know if
you have to refresh my memory?
Yeah, we can back up for you.
All right. I'm excited. I don't know what the symbols are.
There you go. It's for
this one?
Yeah.
All right. So if you look in Excel under data validation, there's a whole bunch of tools that you could use. You could use bars, and inside each cell will display a bar of how much it is. You could use data ranges. So for example, let's take all the numbers and rank them blue to red. So the better numbers are blue, the worst numbers are red, or any number that falls within certain categories, turn it a certain color, and we could do all that through data validation. So these particular ones are just data validation symbols. So I told it, look through these numbers, and any number that's a 5 or a 4, give it a green. Any number that's a 3, give it a yellow, and any number that's below 3, give it a red. Right? So this is just a really quick way, and it happens automatically to put those through, and it's under view data validation. So if you set this up across hundreds of fields, as soon as you type your numbers in, we'll pop up and say, there's a problem, we need to address this. And there's a lot of options to visually find what works best for you.
Cool, thanks. We didn't know that. We didn't know that here. Another question another question that's come in is, would you set up your sheet in SPSS in a similar way?
Okay, that's an excellent question. The answer is maybe. Right? SPSS is a little more complicated on how it uses those individual data fields and how you're able to manipulate them. So in SPSS, it's really important to know which fields are related to each other. And in SPSS, I would try to keep the data to analyzable data. A lot of people use these sheets both to analyze data and to store data, for example, phone numbers. Because those things aren't relevant in SPSS, I would say I would try to balance those two factors to make sure that I understand what kind of numbers they are, so for example, nominal, ordinal, etc., to make SPSS work more efficiently based on the type of data you're collecting. But I think it's similar, but there are subtle differences. That's an excellent question.
Thanks, Sidney. Another question is less around using a spreadsheet. It is about data management, and it's about ethics, like anonymity and security of data. So a person is asking a pretty specific question. How would you protect data for victims of crime when their files can be subpoenaed?
So it really depends on, again, how you use the sheet. Are you using it to collect ongoing data? Are you using it to collect data specific to that case or that person? And what we do in research quite often is that the sheets themselves have a lot of data, but the data itself is all anonymous, right? So I could interview people, I could get information, and then I have a master list which connects the names to the numbers of the file. So, chart 105, it actually refers to a particular person, but that's kept separate from the actual sheets themselves. That's entirely possible to do as well. It really depends on what your need is and what your level of anonymity is required, right? So somebody said to me, why don't we make all sheets anonymous? Because if you're tracking who got what intervention in your program and you're running a youth group, it's important to know who they are. Otherwise, you can't put the information in accurately. Sometimes it actually doesn't matter. So if you're gathering random feedback from people and you just want to know, how did session 1 go? Does it really matter who said what? Probably not. It's probably going to get more accurate results if you do it anonymously. In terms of protecting like a victim of crime, yes, certainly you could have anonymous sheets and you collect that data and then have a key to connect it in case you have to find out who those people are or to go back to it, or if they get subpoenaed, how to do that.
Thanks, Sidney. Someone else wrote in just to say that it's so helpful thinking through the anonymity piece. So thank you again for that. It's resonating with people. Another question that I'm not sure if you'll understand this question or not, and I'll say the question, and if we need some clarification from the person who asked it, perhaps that person can add some clarification. But the question is there a way to lock the preset formulas?
Oh my gosh, Stephanie Oakes, welcome to my world. Seriously, it's the biggest problem I have. People say to me literally all the time, okay, so I'm going to go through this whole process of setting it up, but what happens when somebody goes in and screws it up? That's basically what we're talking about, right? So the reason why, if you noticed on that sheet before, I had one that specifically said variables. That's because I put all my variables on that sheet, all the numbers that I don't want changed, all the formulas that I don't want changed, and then I hide that sheet or I lock it. And then that way, as people are using it, they can't accidentally go in there and start changing things, right? So you could certainly lock formulas, you could lock ranges, you could lock pages. It's possible to lock everything, and you just want to balance usability with how much you lock. But once you have it set up the right way, it means you'll be able to effectively use it and keep on putting information in there without worrying that you're going to break something as you put data in going forward.
Okay, thanks. I hope that is clear for Stephanie. Another question that's come in is related to a very specific Excel challenge that someone is having. How do you make changes in Excel when it's saved in XLS, but it's also read-only and on autosave? They're having problems making changes. Okay,
so the best idea in this situation is, first of all, make sure you download something called, I assume that you're using an older version of Excel, download something called Excel File Format Converter. And basically that's a plugin from Microsoft that will let you open the newer version of Excel sheets on an older copy of Excel, number one. Number two is I would just copy the file that you have right now and save it as a new name. So that same file you have, version 2. When you open that new file up, it will say file is in read-only mode. Would you like to open it anyways? And you press yes, edit mode, and then you'll be able to manipulate it. Also, if you right-click on the file and you go to properties, you'll see that there's a box that's checked off which says, is this a read-only file? Uncheck that box when on the copied file and you should be good to go.
Okay. Thanks, Sidney. Another question is around additional resources. We're wondering if you could recommend any additional resources on how to do counts, charts, graphs, etc.
Well, I'm glad you asked. First of all, I don't know if you know this, but in February we're doing another one of these, which is going to address that specifically. In the meantime, however, there are a million resources online. And let me just grab the I have it in my backpack. So you can literally find everything, how to do it simply on Excel. There's this one right here, how to do anything in Excel. I got this at a used bookstore for $1, and it shows you how to do things really simply. And we're also going to be building Excel modules through YouthREX that you're going to be able to find on the site to literally do everything. If there's one thing that you want to know specifically, tell your hub manager, and we'll start integrating those into the training videos. And we're going to do things that we think work for most programs, because there are a lot of similarities, whether you're gathering information on demographics, on attendance, on participation, on satisfaction, on feedback, on many other things. So we're going to show you both how to gather the data as well as how to do the analysis through these series of videos. But there are so many different resources out there. Microsoft has an especially good one. I think that if you look at the bulk of what Excel can do, it's a little overwhelming when you first turn it on because it could do thousands of different things. To do this type of evaluation, honestly, you only need 10 commands. We actually have a sheet through a presentation that we've done, simple spreadsheeting, that just takes 8 of them. And honestly, using those 8, you could pretty much do everything you could possibly want to do. So I would say the best way to do it is to find an entry point that's really simple, and then try to figure out what data you really want to collect and what you want to get out of it. So what type of analysis do you want to perform? And usually it's relatively easygoing to do it. We work with a lot more complex data. So for example, sometimes we need to take really large amounts of data and put it into Excel. And oftentimes what we'll do to make that simple is using a survey and then exporting the survey into Excel and then doing the analysis in Excel. And that can get really complicated, but that's a good way to talk to your hub manager and figure out what's going on in terms of your CES. But yeah, generally, I think that really once you sit down with it and you play around with it, everybody knows how to use Excel. It's just like Word. You just click on things, highlight, etc. You can figure it out. So I recommend stay tuned for the videos and have fun with it, because it is a lot of fun to do.
Thanks, Sidney. We should note that we already do have some of the videos that you produced up on Vimeo now, and we'll send everyone a link to Sidney's Vimeo videos where he goes more in depth into different functions. But we're planning, like Sidney said, to produce more, and we can also send everyone that worksheet that Sidney prepared on simple spreadsheeting. That's really useful as well. There's one more question, and I think this will be the last one, and then we'll wrap it up. So the last question is about qualitative analysis, and this person asks, how can what you have said be applied to qualitative data? How can spreadsheets work effectively with qualitative data?
I don't know why, but Laura Thomas has to ask the most complicated question right at the end. I know I was so close to getting away from this and not having to answer that. Basically, it depends, right? So Excel is not good at analyzing large amounts of data. Often, when we have qualitative data, we say to somebody, tell me about your childhood, and literally anything can come out, right? Like they'll literally say anything. Or more accurately, how did you like the program? And somebody will say, I love the program, it's great, you should have more pizza. The other person says, well, I don't know, I would have preferred popsicles. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll take that text and do something called thematic analysis. We'll look at what are the common themes. Both of those people in the example I just gave talked about food, right? So what we have, sometimes people do, so we'll have, I'll just draw a quick example. So So we could do something like this, if you could see that, where we put the person's name, we say, is it the pre-test or the post-test, and what did they talk about? And that's just a way of using Excel to sort of come up with the final analysis of which we could easily calculate and so on, of the pre-test outcome and the post-test outcome. If you want to specifically look for particular words, yes, it is possible to do that, and yes, we can count that, but there's other programs like in Vivo which do that a lot better. You could also do that manually with a set of colored markers and then take those results, basically identify themes and put them into the computer. Does Excel do that automatically? It doesn't. But are there ways to manage your data once you have your categories, or when you're looking at number of times set and so on? It can definitely do that. So I think you have to really balance what Excel can do in terms of qualitative with what you're looking for the results to be. So sometimes you could do qualitative in a very quantitative way, like count the number of times someone said help versus the number of times somebody said something else. We could do that simply. If you're looking at identifying themes, you really have to do that yourself because it's very subjective. And then once you do that and go through an iterative process, you could use Excel to manage those themes and figure out how many times they come up and what those things mean.
Yeah, thanks, Sidney. And just to follow up on that question of qualitative data in Excel, I've used Excel to manage qualitative themes before, but like Sidney said, you identify the themes yourself from the primary data, and then you would take, what I've done is use the tabs along the bottom and have different sheets within a spreadsheet be a certain theme, and then code each entry, each row with, you know, where that data came from, and then you can what am I thinking? You can compile it all together within one sheet, and you can read them all at once. But yeah, I agree with what Sidney said in terms of the counting and the qualitative having to be done mainly outside of it. But actually, NVivo, what NVivo does is create a database or a kind of database. But you do the coding, but it puts we've coded into these different themats, and you can export it into a spreadsheet as well. So anyway, that's that. But we'll move on. Thank you everyone for your questions. So we have some upcoming webinars. The one that people should know about is that Sidney will be back with us on February 28th for part 2, and that will be specifically on data analysis using Excel. We have a couple other upcoming webinars. For course participants who are joining us, we have a closed webinar that's just for you. That will be about moving from research and theory into action, pulling it all together. A wrap-up and a time for some feedback as well. So that's December 14th from 12 to 1 o'clock. And then we're also going to do something introducing the exchange to people, but this webinar is now, we're not sure that'll be January 11th. So just kind of disregard that one. And yeah, I think that's sure.
Just a final reminder, we have our last 2 assignments due, one being December the 5th and one December 16th. These are our suggested timelines and our deadlines, and the course finishes December 16th. So for those participants who are on the webinar today, just a friendly reminder. And if you have any questions related to the course, please always email me. I feel like I've chatted with almost every single person in the course, which is really great that everyone is very interactive both on the learning platform and through email. So keep sending your questions my way. I'm always here as a resource, so we appreciate having you guys involved in this course. And for those that aren't in the course, we encourage you to apply for our upcoming one starting in January. So thanks everyone for tuning in today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.